Hello, my name is Samantha Hale, and I'd like to welcome you to the Hues and Histories podcast. Today, I will be taking you through the captivating realm of portraiture in the ancient Near East. A portrait is traditionally understood as a pictorial representation of a person. Yet, as we delve into ancient artistry, we confront a compelling question. Did the ancient Near East practice the art of portraiture as we commonly perceive it? In this discussion, we'll decipher the complexities surrounding the definition of a portrait and unravel the distinct characteristics that set artistic expressions of the ancient Near East apart, which spark debates among scholars about their classification as true portraiture. To begin, I think it's important to define what a portrait is. According to Merriam-Webster, a portrait is a pictorial representation of a person, usually showing the face. Honestly, it's not a great definition, but it is somewhere to start. I think from here we can acknowledge two truths about a portrait, regardless of other caveats. The first thing is that a portrait is representative, and the second thing is that the portrait depicts a person. One of the articles I will be referring to during this discussion is by Dimitri Labary, titled Senweret III and the Issue of Portraiture in Ancient Egyptian Art. In this article, Labary defines portraiture as a depiction in any kind of medium of a specific individual or an individualized representation of a recognizable person. I'm going to use this definition as the basis for answering our topic because this definition seems to be much clearer and concise than the other. It also has a broader definition of what a portrait can be, which I think is important when discussing this matter. So, in order to understand the question at hand, it's really important to cover why the question is being asked in the first place. It seems to be a popular debate among scholars whether or not ancient Near Eastern artworks could be considered portraiture or not. But why would people not consider these works portraiture? What about them is different from other accepted forms of portraiture? Our first answer comes from Irene J. Winter's article, What/When is a Portrait?, in which Winter attempts to accurately define portraiture from an unbiased lens. From my reading of Winter, I think a good jumping-off point would be to understand the traditional view of portraiture and what portraiture means to a general audience. Typically, when we think of portraiture, we think of Western artworks, such as the Mona Lisa or Girl with the Pearl Earring. These are your quote-unquote standard pieces of portraiture, by which a subject is painted while sitting still. Of course, this is not the only form of portraiture, but it is by far the most famous form, and one that typically pops into one's mind when thinking about portraiture. Winter's article explains that the uproar against Near Eastern portraiture is this desire to subjugate these works to Western ideals. But what are Western ideals? Winter further explains that our idea of portraiture and the concept of quote-unquote Western ideals stems way back to ancient Roman portraiture. This form of portraiture was used in memoriam of an individual, or as a form of documentation of an individual. Reasonable likenesses of deceased persons may decorate a sarcophagus lid, or family busts would be carried throughout processions as a way to boast about one's lineage. So what do these examples have in common? Well, it seems that the goal of these works was to create an accurate physical representation of an individual. These works were used as a way to copy a person, essentially. This accuracy, or what it's better described as, realism, is the primary Western ideal that we see stemming across the West through various points in time, from Jan van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait to Jean-François Millet's The Gleaners. These forms of portraiture upheld the role that photographs hold today. They captured a moment in time. Now, the argument against ancient Near Eastern portraiture makes sense. When viewing these works from a Western lens, one may disagree with the works as portraiture because the purposes of these two types of art are very different. Let me give an example. Let's look at the Gudea of Lagash sculpture made in 2110 BCE. Although this sculpture is very obviously of a person, one may argue that it's not a portrait simply because it's not realistic and relies on style. It seems that symbolic works, stylistic or not, were favored by the ancient Near East, and thus this type of portraiture has undergone scrutiny for not being realistic. Gudea well-developed arm is a direct reference to the Sumerian logogram for strength, which is a literal representation, while the statue's large ears are meant to symbolize attentiveness and wisdom. So, it's a piece of art made to be about a person, so why wouldn't it be a portrait? To compare the traditional Roman idea of portraiture, the Gudea sculpture was less of creating an accurate image of the subject, and more about creating a tangible representation of an ideal kingship and the traits associated with that role. The exact representation wasn't important to the Mesopotamian society. What was important was the meaning behind the statue, which held societal significance, reminding others of their king's wisdom and authority. These same ideas are also represented in the sculpture of Ashurnasirpal II of Assyria, made in 875 BCE. This king was also depicted on walls in his palace, in statues, stone stelae, and rock reliefs that served as geographical billboards. His image was not only important to him, but to Assyria. In the Ninurta temple stele, he labels himself and describes the statue as his quote-unquote likeness and as a quote-unquote image of his kingship. Likeness implies similarity, but not a direct copy. It's important to note how he explains the statue as an image of his kingship, not as a direct image of the king. This tells us that the statue was not about the ruler, but about the rule itself. The goal behind this statue was to perpetuate a persona of the king, so that one could assume what traits he had. This contrasts with the Roman example earlier, that came with the expectation of a true likeness at the time the piece was made. But not all art within the ancient Near East valued the same things. There's a huge debate surrounding the 12th dynasty in ancient Egypt and whether the intent behind the works was to chase realism. In the Laborie article, there seems to be an argument that the statuary of Senweret III depicts a quote-unquote traditional portrait that follows the Roman ideal of realism. This stems from a theory fathered by Jacques Vandier that the two statues of Senweret III and their striking similarities and differences prove that realism was preferred in ancient Egypt. In the statues, one is depicted as a juvenile and the other as mature. Vandier's argument is that the facial similarities imply an aging process, and that the accuracy of the physiognomic individualization equates realism and true portraiture. Laborie and I actually disagree with Vandier. But then, what do the statues mean? Referring to other works made for Senweret III, we can find that Senweret III was known for wanting symbolic representations within his depictions. A depiction of him on the lintel found at the Metamud excavation shows a schematic rendering of Senweret III on the left and a detailed rendering on the right. A connection can be made to the god Montu that is displayed on the same lintel, who is also depicted as finely detailed on the right and absent on the mirroring figure on the left. These depictions of Montu relate to his hieroglyphic letter. Interestingly enough, Vandier argues that the same lintel proves the desire for realism due to the sheer detailing on Senweret III's face. Laborie debunks this by explaining that the goal of both of these images is to personify Senweret III's godlike status. These ancient Egyptian kings were viewed as divine and chosen by the gods. Their version of idealism proposed the manifestation of godlike qualities. To prove this, a stele from Senweret III's fortress at Semna discusses the role of the statue. I am a king who speaks and acts, one who takes care of the humble ones, steadily kind but without mercy for enemies who attack him, one who attacks when he attacks, but is still when one who is still. Now, if my majesty is caused to make the statue of my majesty at this border that my majesty has made, it is for the sake of your being firm on it, and for the sake of your fighting for it. This quote leads Laborie to believe that Senweret III's goal behind this statue was to give strength, power, and authority, not about aging or being realistic. These were traits upheld by ancient Egyptian society, and thus another example of a symbolic portrait or image of kingship. So, are they portraits? Throughout this podcast, I've highlighted two distinct differences between the Western and Near Eastern works. Western work preferred realism and creating an accurate representation of an individual, while Near Eastern work preferred creating a visual representation of what the subject chose to be represented as. Portraiture usually opposes the ideal type, implying a pictorial individualization, thus relating realism as an accurate and faithful rendering of objective reality. Both of these notions, or opinions on what portraiture is, refer to reality, which is a metaphysical concept. Ancient Egyptian reality was different from ours, different from Roman reality, and different from Renaissance reality. Because of this, I think it's important to grade the artwork not by the basis of what we perceive portraiture as, but also what they perceived portraiture as. Ancient Egyptian portraits illustrate that artistic imitation of reality is selective and biased to portray an ideal image. Altogether, I think that we've debunked the rumor that ancient Near Eastern art can't be considered portraiture just because of stylistic differences. Thank you for listening and have a great day.